So I can go look up Rin Karagani's YouTube channel, and I can find guides on a couple of the tanks, maybe more by
No,
the
you
time this
can't. You're
goes live.
blocked. Let me go get you
And
right now.
and I can go out to the Balance Discord where I can find you guys telling me all about rotations. But we are going into Endwalker content, which will be lined with patches of all these new fights. And so, if I've made it all the way to this point in the story through healing and DPSing, it can be really overwhelming to feel like, how do I take on tanking in fights I've never
Sure.
seen? I've tried tanking in stuff that I had already run it before. How
Sure.
do I learn mechanics as a new tank, or how do I take tanking in the past where I only tanked in things I was comfortable in and bring that into fights where like the first round of extremes or the first round of savage or even just
Sure.
that first alliance raid when we get to 6.1.
Maybe on Endwalker launch, you get through it and you're like, well, I've only really ever played, monk or bard, right? But then you look at Party Finder, it's like this party needs a tank, that party needs a tank, that party needs a tank. You're like, well, I guess if I'm gonna play the fight, I need to play a tank, right?
Right.
Like, I guess I
And you
gotta
leveled
do it.
yours
What
in
do I do?
PvP, or you leveled yours in leveling roulettes or wondrous
Or
tales, and so
just
you're
your
like,
your your
or beast
fairy
tribes.
dailies,
You're like,
or
oh, it's
yeah.
leveled. I've never played it.
Yeah, I think that you know what? I feel like that especially rings true for some like if you play Summoner and like you have Scholar level, just play it. And you're like, that doesn't mean anything. Please, that doesn't mean anything. So you've got your tank leveled, but you don't really know what you're doing. Um, you want to step into a fight, and we've touched on this in the past, and I'll reiterate it. Hit a dummy for a little while. Just get a semblance for your 1, 2, 3. You don't even have to master a rotation. Just get a semblance for what's your filler, what's your bread and butter. You could mix the other stuff in later, right?
Mm-hmm.
You could just we're gonna do 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. This will be okay. Uh, Next thing you're gonna do is go into a fight. Now, let's touch on a fight that you've already done, right? Maybe for you, Chris, you did White Mage and you went into an Alliance raid, right? And you knew that when you had a marker, I actually think there was a Stormblood Alliance raid where you fought Thunder God Sid, and there was a mechanic where there was an icon above the player's head and they had to pass it. It would hit them, and then they'd have to pass it to a different player, but they couldn't give it to the tanks or the tanks would die. So let's say you're in that situation, right? And you're like, okay, well now I need to pass it. Now you're on a tank, right? You're like, I remember I had to pick this up. Your instinct might tell you to go get that, and now you're gonna die because even though you know the fight, you have to learn it in a different way.
Okay.
So mechanical knowledge can help you and hurt you. In some ways, I would say it is easier, and I can actually speak on this as a tank who switched over to healing for the last tier because we didn't have a healer available and I did it out of necessity. I had to learn new fights for the first time, and I actually had an easier time doing those completely without any knowledge of the fights. I had an easier time learning those on healer than I did adapting from a tank to a healer in fights I had already done a million times on tank because you want to do things in the role you're already doing. You're like, okay, I need to go over there for this.
I can
And then
see
you go
that.
there and you're like, now I'm dead.
I can
Now
see
I'm
that.
dead.
I've been leveling my Fizz ranged, and so I've started each morning with my leveling roulette, and my
Hmm.
first instinct is to pull the first pull. And so I run in there with my AoE, and then I realize very quickly that my life is now at half and dropping. And it's like, oh god, I have made an enormous mistake, and we're about to find out whether this tank is ready to save me or if they even want to save me. Because I'm like, yeah, I'm just gonna Oonga Boonga, and I just charge in, and I just open with a big AoE, and sure
Yep.
enough, everything attacks me. So I can absolutely see that. What mechanics do you think specifically for tanks stand out that maybe like tanks need to respond differently? Tanks that we see, mechanics we see over and over and
In
over.
a more strict way and not a more lax way, right? Like it's something that you have to care about. Because a lot
Mm-hmm.
of times I think mechanics will happen and the tanks aren't directly involved with them, right? You'll see something happening where maybe the DPS and healers have to buddy up or something.
Right.
There's a lot of times that'll happen. And so people will think tanking's easy. It's not a problem. But when the mechanics happen for a tank that you have to care about, that's when
Right.
that's when it becomes a doozy. That's when it becomes
It's
a doozy.
dropping bombs across the back of the room. You're like, that is not my problem.
Let's see. I will pick Leviathan Savage, which is a fight in Shadowbringers. Um, as an example, there's a mechanic called Tsunami, and when that mechanic comes out, each player gets a series of debuffs. In Tsunami 2, one of the tanks is going to get something called Defamation. It's a global term for a giant AoE. And I mean giant. Like, you're not only getting out of the boss's hitbox, but you're going like halfway to Narnia to drop it. If you have never played tank in that fight and you get this marker, you may be like, I don't know what this is. And you'll learn, oh, get away from the party, and you'll do it. And the first time you do it, you're going to hit everybody because you're too slow. And that's one of those things where you have to learn, okay, now not only do I have to get all the way across the arena, I have to be able to gap close back to get back into the party for heals. And that could be a little bit tight or everybody's dead. Later on in that fight, there's something called Black Smokers, which Party Finder ended up dubbing Black Chokers because people would just choke and die to that mechanic. And as a tank, so as a DPS or a healer, you're doing something where you're toggling these ground AoEs back and forth and absorbing them in a way that you don't get killed or kill yourself. The tanks need to be the closest players, and they're going to get like they'll be right up front with the boss, and they're going to shoot these cones out, and they need to plan their mitigation so that they don't die to that while the rest of the team's doing their thing. Your healers are going to be moving a lot, so they can kind of heal you a little bit, but you really want to be on top of your game. Let's see. We could also think of E12 Savage, which you're progressing right now. In Phase 2, at the time of this video, in Phase 2, Oracle of Darkness is going to do a mechanic called Basic Relativity, where everybody needs to be in a particular spot at a particular time with these like traffic lights that are going to go off. The tanks need to be behind the party because what she will do is Oracle of Darkness manipulates time. You're going to get frozen, and you're going to get rewound through everything that you did and how you moved, and at one point you're going to get knocked from one side of the arena to the other. Doesn't seem that bad. If you're a DPS or a healer, you might not understand, even as a tank, you might not understand that there is an aspect of that mechanic happening where the two players closest to the yellow traffic light are going to get tank busted on the knockback. That's what we call a wild charge in Final Fantasy, where it's basically a body block stack mechanic.
What's a tank buster, real quick? Because we talked to some new players here.
That's true. Okay, so if you've ever heard the term tank buster, it might be what it sounds like. If you haven't, it is what it sounds like. It's big damage coming in at a single player. And the reason we call it a tank buster is because chances are that if you're not a tank, you're going to get killed. So we can just call it a non-tank killer. But it's a tank buster because the tanks are going to take it and they need defensives to survive.
So how do we know who it hits? Does it always hit the boss's target?
It does not. 9 times out of 10, you will have it hit the boss's target. Some other times it may hit the second player in aggro. It may target somebody completely random and you might have to block for them. It might be a tethered mechanic. In any number of configurations. In a 24-player alliance, it may hit the top aggro player from each party. So you might be attacking a boss. Maybe you're attacking Sephiroth McFinal Fantasy, and he's attacking you, and you see he's going to be hitting Chris, and a tank buster starts casting, and now I've got a red swirl around me, and Chris has a red swirl around him because I'm the player who had threat in my alliance party, which an alliance is 3 parties of 8. So you have light parties of 4, full parties of 8, and an alliance is 3 full parties. So you might see that happen. And tank busters and other mechanics, sometimes they will be telegraphed, which is where you see exactly who they're picking and what they're doing. Other times they'll be untelegraphed, where you don't see who they're hitting, but you'll see a cast bar. And in rare circumstances, you'll even see, it's less common now, I would say, where things will target and hit people, and you won't know until it's already done. You just have to know that it could do something to you at that time.
So I think 2 things that when I first learned a tank confused me, which the first time I was exposed to kind of endgame tanking was WoW, and the first time I really took tanking seriously beyond casual content was in 14. So my background with it is a little all over the place for how long I've been playing MMOs. The concept of tank swap and then the concept of stacks are 2 things that like I really feel as a tank were really hard to learn because there wasn't anything exactly like them in the fact that I'd played DPS and healer at that point. How do you
we touched on enmity before. Real caveat on WoW, real quick. So we touched on tank swapping before in another video, and I just want to reiterate that enmity, hate, aggro, you use it with a skill called provoke to put you at the top. In WoW, that would be taunting, right? So just real quick, so that WoW players who might have come from that get that terminology. And you're right, there isn't something innately like that. I think in World of Warcraft, there's a lot of crowd control management, and you do taunting, but it's kind of like you can kind of spam it a little bit more than Final Fantasy. There's a big cooldown in Final Fantasy. So a couple things real quick if you don't know. Your basic attack is called the GCD. It's a global cooldown because it rotates on a global timer. And if you ever delay it, everything you do on that global timer is just permanently displaced. So you want to keep that running. Typically, mitigation is going to be tied to an off global cooldown, which is going to be an instant that you use in between. They don't typically have cast bars, so you use your off globals in between. And I'm saying typically because that could change in the future. And in the past, we've had mitigation tied to a GCD, so that is subject to change. So as far as enmity control goes, let's say you've never played an MMO, Chris, right? If I told you that you had to make sure that you had to keep enmity on the boss and make sure that it's looking at you at all times, how does that affect you mentally? What's your approach on that now? How do you feel about that?
So my first response is that it feels wrong. So I played single player RPGs long before I played MMOs, and so one of the best ways to survive when you're playing Zelda or a Final Fantasy game or something like that is don't stand in front of the boss. Like anytime the boss comes at you, I'm getting out of there. And so my first response is, why would I even want to do that? Like why now, and so if you've never played in a D&D game that had a traditional party, like you might be like, hey, none of us really want everything facing us. So the idea that you're just going to bring it, it's like, yeah, but you have big armor. Okay, well, it's not my fault you didn't bring armor. Like, just because I plan doesn't mean I have to absorb all the hits.
Right.
That sounds crazy, especially when you talk about games where the amount of healing is very limited and you don't have a dedicated person who's doing that full time and was willing to focus on me. That's a lot of trust. So the first thing is, why would I want to do that? The second is, okay, now I've worked really hard to get it mad at me. Why would I give that up to the other tank? We talk about control in a previous video in this series, and like, I'm getting to set the pace. I came in here as a tank, which means I do want to tank. And so now I run in this content like Deliberum, for example, that has a lot of tanks sometimes. I want to come in there as tank. Otherwise, I would have come in as something else. And they're just taking it from me. So the idea that there would be mechanics where I would just willingly give that away, make that confusing. So the idea that we call it a tank swap is exactly what it sounds like. But why would I even want to do that in the first place is much more ephemeral.
Because our primary goal is to set a comfortable pace for the party. And the healers are part of that party. So if we can use our cooldowns in a way that makes it so we're alleviated, maybe you're going to run all of your defensive mitigation that we talked about, which is just your ability to reduce damage. And now you're exhausted. You have nothing left, but you still want to hold the boss. If I can reduce the incoming tank buster that's about to hit us by more than half, and you can't reduce it at all, and it's going to hit for more than your maximum HP, it's probably not a good idea.
Okay.
And there are sometimes fights where tank swaps are forced. Maybe a tank buster hits you with a debuff, and now you are prevented from tanking for the next minute or 20 seconds, or else you die. That's a reasonable reason to tank swap. You don't want to die.
Okay.
Or maybe we're just taking turns because we want to help our healers out. Maybe there's even a fight where you don't have to do that. We've talked before where there's sometimes fights where the incoming damage is so lax that you don't have to worry about it. And there's other times where every single time a tank buster happens, we'll both be hit. Or the boss is hitting us with double auto attacks. Shiva Savage is one of them. There is also Demon Chadornuk, which is a Stormblood raid, where both tanks are actively taking autos at the same time. Diamond Weapon as well, where both taking autos, so we're both tanking. Even though the boss might be looking at somebody on the aggro list as saying, like, I'm attacking you, Chris, his other hand's hitting me, right? So we're both taking it together.
Okay. And then I think the last thing that as a tank feels weird is when I see the rest of the party getting together in a stack marker, because we've talked about I want to keep the boss still. And so it feels wrong if they're all stacking. Don't I want to stay where I am? Or actually, you say stack, do we all need to stack? And when I say all of us, does that include me? And so that's an area that, like, I think as a tank, I see new tanks. Sometimes they're running into stacks where I'm like, you really shouldn't have done that. And other times I'm seeing them stand there and I'm like, I could really use you over here. Or at least use one of your like AoE mitigations that saves all of us some health because we don't
which
have
every
armor.
tank has. Every tank has something to help reduce damage for the whole party. And stacking, I would say, is situational, right? There are times where maybe a stack is happening and something's happening to the tank at the same time. Maybe there are times where they need you because somebody else is missing the stack and normally you'd stay out of it, but they need you right now or they're all dead. And there's no point in having a fight where you're the only one alive, where everyone else is not alive. I think one thing we haven't really mentioned yet, you and I may just feel like it's unspoken,
Sure.
but it's incredibly important. In Final Fantasy XIV, there is unavoidable damage. We talked about
Yeah.
not being in front of the tank, but sometimes you'll be hit by something as a non-tank or even as a tank, and you're like, I could have sworn, how do I dodge that? How do I avoid that damage? But in Final Fantasy XIV, there is damage that is literally unavoidable. It's targeted damage, it just happens. And there is damage that is avoidable. You're like, wow, that tank buster hurt me really bad, and it stunned me for 12 seconds. Or it gave me a damage down. That's weird. And chances are, if you receive a detrimental effect after being hit by something and everyone else moved and they didn't receive that effect,
Right.
it was probably avoidable.
Stuns, damage downs, vuln stacks are all three things
Paralysis.
that all yeah, when you see those sort of things go out where there's a debuff that you see 4 people get hit and 4 people not get hit, and you see the 4 people all get an identical marker, odds are that means there was a way to avoid that mechanic. Which means that the boss was telling you where to go through what people refer to as a telegraph, but there was something that was giving you an indication. The way the boss held the weapon, the way they were facing, the name of the ability.
Maybe they stopped. Maybe they were like flapping their wings, then they just did like this for a second, and then hit. Things like that. There are also times where you'll receive a debuff and it's completely normal, and then the same attack happens again, right? And this time you take it and you die. And you might be like, okay, these 4 players got hit and they received a debuff, and then the boss started doing the same exact attack again.
Yeah.
And then I died, but the other 3 people who didn't have the debuff took it, and now 7 people have a debuff and I'm dead. And you're like, okay, there was just a swap. And that happens too.
So I think this is a big topic. I think Xenosis on YouTube, people know him for his Twitch, but on YouTube he has a Tank University video set literally talking just about this topic. You could expand on it, literally fight by fight, type by type. There is, what is a tank buster is a whole topic in itself, and it's big. But I think the point is, as we move into Endwalker, there will be things that are based on themes of abilities we've seen in the past.
Yes.
That will be new, and there will probably be a handful of abilities that are just new altogether. And they'll be communicated maybe like, oh, well, the ground effect is still orange, or, it's still done with the way the boss moves or something like that, but it will still mostly feel new. That happens
Absolutely.
every expansion. And so I think it is something that as tanks go in and they wonder, well, how am I expected to tank this if I don't know? I think it comes down to just making sure that you know that you're not supposed to know. That you can't know, especially if you're going to go in without a guide. And some content like dungeons, they don't really get guides anymore since the trust system came out, because the handful of people that were making guides like that, they're harder to find those guides because they don't get watched by as many people, because the trust system allows, if you'd like, for you to go tank for a set of NPCs, which removes all likelihood that they're going to talk trash or anything if you make a mistake, because Thancred doesn't care.
But the AI is adapting and will still teach you. During the Mediatory, we ran a dungeon, there was a trust, and there's a mechanic that happens where the trusts will not do the mechanic until you've completed it, and then they'll come into place, which is nice because it teaches you. And they're like, and you're like, what are they doing? I'm just going to follow them. But it's nice because it'll teach you in a way that you're not pressured, because again, they're not going to trash talk you or anything, right?
Nope.
So it's comfortable.
You're not wasting their time.
And
they got all day.
I know we talked about anxiety for tanks. Let me talk to you about something that's really nice. You can do something called tank privilege, which is when you fail a mechanic and you keep going because you had so much hit points and so much armor that you just lived, and anybody else would have died. And I'd be lying if I said that wasn't really cool, especially in progression where you just want to see the next thing and you didn't know something was coming. Maybe you'll die, but if you live, you're like, I learned.
Yeah, faster queue times. A lot of times the adventure need, the type of role that is most missing, is oftentimes tanks. With Sage
rewards
being added, it will often be there. So we get extra, we'll get extra currency or extra materia or whatever. So we'll get a lot of cool stuff, as well as every once in a while you get to live through something that you shouldn't have. That should not be taken as a chance to be well, I don't have to move out of this. But
no, it does let you learn what happens.
Let you learn.
Don't. You're like, all
Uh,
right, cool. Now this will kill me.
and so that's a great point to end on as we talk about mechanics, as we look at new mechanics, whether they are
Mhm.
just new to you or they are new to the game as a whole. I think tanking is something that it gives me a really good perspective of the fight because a lot of times I'm backed up to a wall and I get to see the whole
Sure.
room. So I think we do have the best seat in the house for many fights. Unlike I think WoW, where a lot of times tanking really felt like the bosses were so big that a lot of times I was really just looking
Oh,
at
you
boss
can't see through
crotch,
them.
and
Or
so
another
I
time, maybe your range died, right? And the melee didn't see what killed them, and the range didn't know what killed them, but you did. You're like, I saw exactly
yep.
what happened to you. You walked off the side.
So I found that for me, tanking was the single biggest improvement in myself as a 14 player. It's actually one of
Mhm.
the things that made me stick with it is that as somebody that wanted to make guides and stuff for the community, I found I'm just more informed when I go into content blind as a tank. I feel I learn
Sure.
it better. I feel I recognize it better when I go into it as other classes. And so I think it's a great thing for everybody to try. And I wouldn't let mechanics be the reason that I'm not going to.
That's true. And likewise, I would even say as a tank, try the other roles. If maybe you're a tank just watching this because you just want to listen to tank stuff, try the other roles too. It'll help you. Just like playing a tank is going to be the other way around for them.